I want you to close your eyes and think back to the year 2018. Some ways, feels like a long way away, but objectively, it wasn't. It was 6 short years. And yet, in those 6 short years, one of the most sweeping social revolutions in the United States has happened beneath our feet, and we are only just starting to grapple with it. That is the mass legalization and normalization of online sports gambling. The mass legalization and normalization of sports gambling has the potential to rival the opioid epidemic in the United States. Its destruction of the American family unit. And yet today, almost all lawmakers are lockstep in their support of it. The roots of online sports gambling boom in the United States trace back to a 2018 Supreme Court decision after a petition was filed by the state of New Jersey challenging something known as the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, or PASPA. PASPA passed in 1992, effectively restricted all legal sports gambling action to the state of Nevada. And now this is stuck in New Jersey's craw in 2009, especially after the Great Recession. They needed a way to bail out Atlantic City casinos. So on their behalf, they brought the suit against the law, where it would be eventually resolved in their favor in 2018. Now, in the 9 years where New Jersey brought the suit against PASPA, something important also happened: the absolute explosion of something called daily fantasy sports. Daily fantasy sports was effectively a loophole allowing people to place wagers on fantasy sports leagues and daily payouts, something that many Americans were already doing in their spare time. It aligned perfectly with the rise of the smartphone. Companies like DraftKings and FanDuel began their entry into the market under this guise. So it was at this time where the roots of the epidemic were laid. Wagers were already being placed in mass by millions of Americans, and the normalization of gambling on the phone was planted. Perhaps most importantly, though, these companies began to hone their strategies, which include insane levels of marketing focused on one specific message: it's a game of skill, and you can hit it big. Now, in a sense, they are correct, but there's a lot more subtext removed, which I will return to later. Suffice to say this: they were already tanned, rested, and ready for the Supreme Court decision, which opened the floodgates. On May 14, 2018, the Supreme Court struck down PASPA. Within a month, the state of Delaware began accepting single-game wagers, which would be seen as tame today. By the end of the month, 7 states had legalized sports gambling, and by today, as I speak, 39 states, including the District of Columbia, have it legalized. Now, it's important to note, when I say legalized, it doesn't mean that it's a free-for-all. What it really means is that a few mega companies like DraftKings, FanDuel, PrizePicks, and others have effectively rolled up the legal sports betting market by getting separate states to grant them preferential licenses to run action in their state. This is important because the quasi-monopolistic way that sports gambling runs on a state-by-state basis means that it is not a fair marketplace. And 2, it means that their excesses and sins are multiplied to absolutely stupendous profit, and fundamentally are altering the way that American sports leagues will operate for decades to come. So let's take some time to ruminate on gambling itself and the attitudes of the United States towards it over the years. It's fair to say the U.S. has undergone an extraordinary transition from effectively a nation of prudish Christians to much more secular libertarians in the span of just a few decades. This is evident in current social attitudes, from everything on abortion, gay marriage, to marijuana, and now sports gambling. Gambling itself was traditionally viewed as a sinful, backwards activity that was actively discouraged by the state for centuries. Now, the compromise that we got to was one that I actually think is quite sensible. People will always gamble. Let's not make it too easy. You can do it, but you have to go to a physical casino. There are governing bodies like the Nevada Gaming Commission, which make sure that these games are run fairly. And in general, that attitude was to confine it to as small places as possible that are accessible, who are committed, but who did not want to make it part of everyday life. Quite sensible, in my opinion. Should be applied to all vices. We understand they exist, but it shouldn't be too easy to indulge, from cigarettes to alcohol. And this has been an attitude in America now for decades. But then everything changed. And now all of a sudden, sports gambling is not just legal, but it's available everywhere. At the click of a button on your smartphone that's always in your pocket, to hundreds of millions of Americans. And the results are in. They're astonishing. Since 2018, U.S. customers have placed approximately $500 billion in bets at legal sports books and climbing, turning a nation that had rare access to sports gambling into the largest gambling marketplace on earth. This has transformed the finances of everyday Americans in a way that has not happened in generations. My friend Charles Lehman summed up 3 separate large-scale studies. The top-line findings are this: for every $1 waged on sports betting, household savings is depleted by $2. Legalized online gambling has increased the risk of household bankruptcy in a state by 25 to 30%. And worst of all, legalized sports gambling has massively increase the rates of domestic violence, specifically against spouses of those who lose. Unsurprisingly, all of these effects are felt by the most economically precarious households, and the financial effects are concentrated amongst young men. Fair to say it's been a disaster. So let's go through the arguments for why, even though all of this is really bad, we should overlook it. First is philosophical argument. This is what living in a free society looks like. That just because some people can't control themselves, we shouldn't ruin the fun for everyone. I understand that argument. I agree with it partially. But I would say this: the US has recognized always that we can respect freedom of choice while also recognizing that when something is bad and trying to reduce said behavior for the societal benefit of all citizens, we should. We have arrived at this with a sensible attitude, for example, towards cigarettes. We know cigarettes are bad, so we tax them. We restrict their place of sale. We don't allow cigarette companies to advertise on television. We have developed good social norms around not wanting people to smoke. Nonetheless, something like 20% of Americans still smoke, but it's down from a record of like 40 or 50% decades ago, and new uptake in smoking continues to reduce. Now, compare cigarettes to online gambling. DraftKings, FanDuel, BetMGM, Prize Picks are allowed to flood the airwaves with a single message. All you have to do is use your skill and your genius, and you can become a winner. I will explain soon how this is a complete lie. But second is this, and what I want people to understand: it is impossible for these companies to run a fair operation that does not rely on exploiting gambling addicts and to still make a profit. A new study by the Southern Methodist University tracked 700,000 online sports bettors for 5 years. They found less than 5% of users ever withdrew any profit. The remainder of the users either broke even or lost money, covering the winnings of those 5. But worst is this: 3% of all bettors who lost the most accounted for 50% total revenue of these online sports betting companies. In other words, less than 5% of people actually realized any profit. The rest were losers, and the big losers lost so much they made up 50% of total revenue. Now couple this with the dirty secret of online sports betting. If you are one of the less than 5% who win, you're lucky if you're allowed to gamble for even a few months on these apps. Once you start to win consistently, these gambling companies are fully within their rights to limit your bet size to amounts to less than 10 or even $1, meaning that if you're any good, they are allowed to restrict your action and their potential exposure. So this is an outrageously good business, isn't it? You can promise people they can get rich. If they actually do, you cut them off. Then you employ all company resources towards extracting as much as humanly possible from gambling addicts to make up 50% of your revenue. In other words, if these gambling companies were forced to allow fair play and then follow their own guidelines around restricting addicts, something they are legally required to do, they would go bankrupt, and this entire farce would fall apart. Take the story of a New Jersey man known to us as Mdalo 1990. In 2020, this man never placed a bet in his life. By 2024, he had lost approximately $1 million despite making an income of $175,000 per year. He drained his wife's investments, he maxed out their credit cards, he drained his young children's savings accounts, and sold the gifts that they were given for Christmas and their baptisms. Now, it's really easy to say, yeah, it's his fault, screw him. But according to his wife's lawsuit, this user was contacted on a daily basis by DraftKings VIP hosts. They facilitated his access to gambling products despite knowing it was impossible for him to be able to support the amount of money that he was placing on wagers with his W-2 income. Their own policies, as dictated by the state, require them to have gamblers placing large sums prove their ability to furnish funds by providing them a W-2 statement or bank statements. According to his wife, quote, they knew he would not be able to continue to gamble large sums of money if they required verification, and they also knew the source of the money was, quote, illegitimate. A modest amount of due diligence required by their own policies would have shown he did not have the ability to wager, literally 4 times his literal W-2 salary. Throughout this entire time, again, on a daily basis, DraftKings threw so-called free promotions at him: whiskey glasses, VIP tickets, and more. Now, they do not do this out of the goodness of their heart. As I said earlier, people like this man constitute only 3% of gamblers, but make up 50% of revenue. In fact, some people have caught on. A new number of pro sports bettors are mimicking the behavior of people like Mdalo 1990. They log into their accounts in the middle of the night to make it seem like they cannot sleep without checking their bets. Why? Because it flags to the algorithm that they are gambling addicts. It means that the company is more likely to shower you with so-called free promotional money and to continue your addiction chain. This is fundamentally different than alcohol or cigarette companies. Cigarette companies are not allowed to advertise, period, let alone literally sponsor major sporting events. Furthermore, cigarette companies are not allowed to identify their so-called super smokers and shower them in free and addictive cigarettes to encourage their addiction. Same with alcohol companies or any other vice. In this case, the statistics show us that the profit margins and the very business model of these companies rely on so-called problem gamblers to prop up the revenue of the entire company. And now let me take it even a step further, because now imagine if cigarette companies had a super addictive special cigarette, and that cigarette was the one that they are marketing the most, pushing and making the most money on. That is the case of online sportsbooks, who are pushing a particular type of bet called a parlay bet. Most of you probably know what it is, but it's simple. A parlay bet is a contingent bet, where several discrete events have to happen for you to win. Parlay bets, unsurprisingly, have the biggest payouts, and unsurprisingly, they have the biggest loss rate for gamblers. Why? Because they're unlikely. And yet, this exact bet, the parlay bet, is the one most pushed, most marketed, and most used by online sports bettors. The largest online sportsbook in the United States, FanDuel, has amassed 46% market share in the United States, specifically by marketing massively profitable single-game parlay bets, which are gigantically profitable for the company. We don't have exact data. We do know this from the state of Illinois. 60% of all wagers in the state wagered online are parlay bets. We also know that the online sportsbook know that they will win with such regularity, they build it into their profit forecast before the customers even officially lose, and they remain the single most profitable bet to the company. So again, bringing it back to a cigarette comparison, you target the most addicted, and you sell them the worst thing for them. The system is built on a simple premise: ban winners, milk losers for all they're worth. All of you who are placing small wagers for fun is great, but the thing is, it's only enabled by crippling addicts. Already, Gamblers Anonymous is reporting massive spikes in the number of young bettors calling their hotline, coming to their meetings. Some children as young as 14 have found their ways to bet their parents' phones are full addicts. This will only continue, which brings me back to the comparison I made at the top. It took nearly a decade to reckon with Purdue Pharma and the OxyContin crisis. It created an entire generation of previously not known heroin addicts. But the signs a few years were all there. And now we've unleashed an addiction with one of the highest rates of people taking their own lives and made it easily accessible to hundreds of millions of Americans. If anything, this trend is accelerating. Literally just a few days ago, the state of Missouri legalized sports gambling, now the 40th state to do so. And so, when people come back to this in a decade, and we have millions of gambling addicts, high rates of domestic violence, alcoholism, and we need to figure out what to do, let me offer this modest proposal. The solution is staring us all in the face. More of what we used to do. PASPA was correct about one thing. It is not fair that Nevada is the only monopoly on sports gambling. So instead, adopt a model what the UK used to have. Sports betting is legal and available in person at parlors, which are widely accessible. People can access it, but it requires physically having to go to a location with cash. This introduces the same level of friction that all other vices are governed by in the US. Second, betting organizations must be subject to fairness rules. If they advertise anyone can win, then everyone must be allowed to win. They cannot be allowed to limit sharp sports bettors and must have a truly free marketplace. 3, we must have heavy oversight on the ongoing fusion between professional sports and gambling companies. You can call this nanny state intervention if you want, but here's the truth. The NFL, the National Football League itself, it only exists because of multiple acts of Congress and preferential treatment from the US government. Sports and the NFL are important to the American character. Gambling corruption scandals are already beginning to question the very integrity of the game itself. Leagues have become physically intertwined with multi-billion-dollar gambling behemoths is a recipe for corruption and disaster. So I will end with a warning that I gave many years ago. Sometimes private industry can be just as much of a threat to your freedom and liberty as the government itself. And in this case, I think it is quite clear the damage gambling companies have wrought and will continue to do to America's families poses a direct threat to our country. I am clear-eyed. It will only get worse. But I hope I could help all of you at least think about what I believe is going to be a major problem of our time.